Hello, welcome back to On the Mic with Mike. I am Mike Jarvis. My guest this time around, again, is Nerissa Golden of Discover Media, Discover Montserrat, and the Discover Montserrat Group. We are talking about and reviewing the recently held general election in Montserrat. We all know what the outcome is. The big question is, where do we go from here? But there's another important question that has to do with how the election campaign across all parties involving all independents was conducted, the whole navigation process, branding, campaigning around that. Nerissa, welcome. You are the pro on these things, especially when it comes to branding, profiling, marketing, getting your message out. What is your overall assessment of this recently held election campaign?
There was a time, I think it's about 10, 15 years ago, I actually co-wrote an article with another monstration, another marketing specialist, Ursula Bazzi, that in the years to come, elections would be won or lost by social media. And I think over the years, we've seen that evolve for Montserrat. I think 2014 was the first year that we saw a party, and PDM that year used it quite effectively. And I don't think anybody was, and yes, they had outside help that year, and it really reflected in how they showed up, not just on social, but then also in the community. This time around, I would say, MCAP had a very clean image in terms of their branding. They were consistent very early from the time they announced that they were election was coming. MCAP came out, with the colors and with everything. I think the other parties were talking, but we didn't see any sense of branding, cohesiveness, any imagery that says this was going to be something they were going to take seriously. I think they eventually everybody hired somebody and said, okay, let's do something. And you saw the social media content pick up. But overall, in terms of if you were looking at the look, then the MCAP image definitely was there. It was consistent with the yellow and green. But obviously, imagery alone and social media wasn't enough to bring them another round in office.
I was just about to point that out. But
Mhm.
on a broader scale, are we seeing a shift from the traditional methods of campaigning, or is it more unique to a Montserrat situation? Because the traditional methods of campaigning, the massive rallies, the party-like atmosphere, we had a bit of that towards the end in Montserrat. But this shift towards social media, is this the way that you see it more heading in Montserrat? And is it working?
Well, you see, I think if we go back a bit to when Barack Obama first won the elections, that was when Facebook was just coming online, and so we began to see socials being used in that way. His first and his second round, and we've seen it work for good, for bad, because you can get really targeted in what you show people. I think because our connections with the diaspora are so important to how we consume information and have an impact. I think it's much more than just the colors and things like that. It really comes down to who is using the social, to who has an audience on social media, who are able to then sway people to different sides. So it's not just about whether the party is using it, it's going to be who is following them, and how are they able to then convince the people around them that this is the party of choice. And I think one of the things that I felt, was that a lot of people weren't really paying attention to the impact the diaspora was having on the local conversations and how important it was. So while some people still wanted to do the house to house thing, which nothing wrong with that, it also meant that there were other people who had voices who you were used to hearing from, who were able to galvanize a lot of support for their party of choice online. And I think, Mike, one of the things that we have to remember is it's not just about what you do in those 2 months while you're campaigning or however long it is. It really is about how are you perceived overall consistently all the time. So you can't exactly have one look, one view on social pre-campaign, and then you suddenly want us to believe that you now have a capacity to lead a country if you've been acting the fool online or you've just had a very negative reputation. And I just think it goes deeper than just the socials for the moment. It really is about how are you building your brand and what's the reputation that people have of you as they see you online.
And that is so correct because I've seen, particularly towards the end of the campaign or when the campaign was hitting its peak, an improvement in the social media presentation. But you can have a very glitzy social media profile, but at the end of the day, it's how you are perceived on the ground,
Yeah.
to put it that way, where the votes really do matter, where the voters are registered. And if you're, whatever your manifesto is, whatever your campaign profile is, if that is not translated into believability, you can have the most glitzy social media campaign. It actually requires a lot more than that, doesn't it?
Absolutely, because the thing is, these are people that you know. These are people that see you in the bar, see you in the supermarket. They know whether you pass them straight all the time. Because we always talk about the fact that when election time comes is when the politicians roll down their windows. The rest of the time, once they're in office, they're in their air conditions. They don't talk to anybody. So it wasn't a time for you to try to come along and become something that you're not, because it was a very critical elections, and people needed to see all along that you were aware that you were connected. So it wasn't a last minute push on social that was going to get you any wins. It really is what's the message that people have been giving about who you are consistently over time. And the noise online pre campaigning, pre anything, was that people weren't very happy. And we know when people aren't happy on the ground because we hear it in the diaspora. Because we locally, people may not talk. They, again, because of how everybody works and they're so critical in terms of the job situation. Then it's usually you hear the pain from the people overseas who are saying, wait a minute, what's going on here doesn't make sense. So we tend to hear a lot more about what's happening locally from the people outside, because for some reason, I guess they're further afar, but they can also kind of gauge the temperature a bit better. And that's definitely what we heard
and
leading up to the campaign and during the campaign. They were actually louder than the locals as it relates to how critical it was this election and why there was a need for change.
And also, this is one of the main reasons why I'm speaking with you or drawing on your expertise in matters of marketing and branding, and particularly social media in this respect. Because one thing I noticed that even though the campaigning, yes, was on the ground, practically all of the rallies and radio interviews and what have you were also live streamed.
Yep.
And the conclusion that you can draw from that is, when I looked at, well, how the cameras were operated, sometimes very selectively, the turnout compared to previous years, as I would recall, was very, very small in person on location, but you're
Mm.
live streaming it to a wider audience, not just a wider local audience, but principally a diaspora audience. So,
Yes.
how does that work? Why?
Well, Montserrat has always been one of the islands that I have seen um, a very high usage of live streaming for content. Um, and one, we know that we do it for funerals just because of how important funerals are, and it's not always able for people to come home. And so, especially even though it was that way before COVID, I think with COVID now gave us permission to not physically have to get up and go anywhere. We can now sit down at home and just get everything fed to us. And it's become kind of a safety mechanism as well, because I can stay home and and talk all I want. And it's also cheaper as well. I have to go nowhere. I just have to turn on my internet, on my phone. Um, and that's another thing is people have tended to be more housebound just to because it's also just expensive to be out, Mike. The cost of fuel, the cost to eat out, the cost to socialize, it costs a lot of money. So suddenly it's just easier to do that. And I have to say, these campaigns they weren't flush with money. I didn't see anything that looked like they were rolling in dough. I heard, there's some talk about campaign financing and things like that. I was like, I wish somebody was showing. There was no, just the level, the imagery, the way people looked, the way the politicians dressed. There was there quite a few people have said it's one of the brokest campaigns we've ever seen. you know so I think even for the people it was easier just to stay at home than to go out. And also, especially when you're not sure how you're voting because it's so critical, it's probably best not to be seen with a particular camp because you not necessarily have decided yet who you're voting for. So it became very easy for people just to consume the content. Yeah, you didn't necessarily have to watch it live because you could go back and watch it later and make your decision based on that. So that's just something that's become the norm. So live streaming in Montserrat, I don't think it's going to ever go back the other way. But it also means you now have to consider all the different ways that people want to connect with you and how you are going to be able to convince them if you don't also still have that personal connection outside of that,
And in terms of
the screen.
Yeah, and in terms of consuming the content and debating the issues and the whole public debate surrounding all that was going on and the promises and the pledges, et cetera, that was largely conducted online and to
Yes.
a large degree involving the diaspora, but also people at home in Montserrat, which raises the other issue of, in some respects, leading up to the campaign, one got the impression that the diaspora, was being vilified. But is it that once the campaign started, that vilification started tapering off a bit because somehow the concerns that people had in Montserrat that, well, for whatever reasons they couldn't express, I would suspect that one of those reasons could lead back to the absence of Basil Chambers' popular What's on Your
Mhm.
Mind from Radio Montserrat. So the outlet for that became social media,
Yes.
and the manner in which folks in the diaspora could be outspoken, thereby, in a sense, relaying back to Montserrat and back to the politicians and political aspirants what the real concerns on the ground were.
That's a really interesting question because I think part of that, then you have to ask yourself, who do you want to listen to? Because sometimes the voices that you're hearing, the loudest voices, when you check, is like, when last have you been in Montserrat? When last have you been on the ground? And often you see the challenge put out there is like, you haven't come home in 20, 30 years, so why do you have such a strong opinion about who should be in government when you haven't even been on the ground? So it becomes also a tenuous situation of, is it everybody that you listen to, or is it the people that are still regularly coming home? They may not be able to vote, but you also recognize they have deep respect and love for their country, and every
And they have
opportunity they
relatives
get.
there. They have relatives there
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, but also they have a personal connection because all everybody can say they have relatives there, but it's about, do we see you on the ground? Do we see you as somebody that is just making noise on social, or is it that it really matters to you? So there was some of that sifting that you had to do as well in terms of understanding who was speaking, why were they speaking, and what was in it for them, to do that. So it wasn't just a matter of taking everything, but definitely the diaspora, the volume was quite loud and consistently throughout the campaign for sure.
And that, in one way or another, is more than likely to impact policies, government policies going forward. So we have a new government in place now. If you were to give them advice in terms of getting their message out, because as I've been saying, the expectation level on this new government is quite possibly higher than it has been on any previous government in recent times because of this whole campaign ethos of now or never. It's the breaking point. We're at the crossroads. And yes, I've been putting in my 2 cents on that we're at a reset moment.
Mhm.
How important then does social media, the internet, become for this new government in getting its policies out, in getting its message out, not only to the people in Montserrat, but the Montserratians globally, who ultimately would also be affected?
It is super critical. Mike, I will tell you that when governor, the current governor, when she first was appointed, the minute I remember she was on social on Twitter, because most of them are on Twitter, if nowhere else. And she began tweeting about Montserrat just from the moment she knew that that's where she was coming. She was doing her homework and she was positioning herself and using the mediums that were there to show that her excitement. And I remember cautioning several of our leaders about the fact that I said, you're not paying attention to what's happening, in that we don't know this woman yet, but I know she is already making sure that she is using the available mediums to let people know who she is, what she's about, and the fact that she's coming here to work for Montserrat. Whether you agree with her policy or anything like that, she understood the value of making those connections. That is something that all of our governments have always taken for granted. And it's always still this kind of last resort. But you think we're living in a country, in a world now where that's how most of our people make decisions. How we decide which restaurant we're going to, what outfit we're going to wear. We go online and we ask people's opinion. So to try to run a government without at least be listening to what your people are saying online is a very, very dangerous way to try to be in power. Um, as in previous years, I heard the new premier, talk about the fact that, oh, we got to build this diaspora database, and I just laughed because I'm thinking, what? All this money that we've spent to build these databases over the years, why up to now we still don't have any data? You
Exactly.
know? So for me, that says that everybody has just been giving it lip service, but no one seriously done the work to make sure that our people have a way to connect with home. And I think that's a critical role that the UK office can play and should play. It needs to become an office that becomes that conduit to be sharing information with the people about what's happening at home. It's supposed to be being a conduit for whether it's the bank or the investment opportunities. Everything should be running through that office. It's not just it's not just for show. It's not just to lay down flags on at official ceremonies. It really has the power to be a much more impactful and resourceful organization, for Montserrat. So it's for the leadership to actually put some action behind the words. When we say, oh, the diaspora is important to us, what does that mean? What does that look like? And I think the diaspora should actually challenge them to make sure that this time around, you don't just forget that we helped you to get elected, but that you actually support us in the way that you represent us, because it's important. We feel like we're part of Montserrat, and we need to make sure that you hear us and us giving us what we need to be a part of that.
And speaking about the that diaspora Montserrat at home connection, we're not only looking then at the situation of the United Kingdom, because the diaspora in the United States, the diaspora in Canada, diaspora
Yes.
throughout the Caribbean, diaspora, wherever the Montserrat diaspora is.
Mhm.
I've seen some Montserratians in some places. Like, what are you doing here? Right?
Exactly. I mean,
Is that
and
so? Sorry, I'm just about to say that
mhm.
the connecting point is the internet slash social media.
Right. And you have to think, we have to redefine even some of the offices. I've seen that the new government has changed some names on some ministries and things like that. But imagine now that your director of external affairs or regional affairs, as we call it, it's not just about the OECS and CARICOM, but now you also have some responsibility to look at our monstrations that live in other islands, you know? We I think it's up to everyone to begin to think about how can we redefine these roles and jobs that we have so that they're actually serving the people who we have. We don't have to stick to labels just because that's what the job description always was. What do we need it to be now so it's actually serving the people that we are called to serve? And it's definitely a time. Yes, I know. Premier loves to use that, and I love that everybody loves that phrase, all hands on deck. But what does that really mean? How are you going to make sure that you know all the hands that are available and that you're actually using them in the places and the spaces that we need them the most? And we need a lot more of that happening, and we need it happening very, very quickly.
And that's where the internet, social media comes into the picture and can play a massive role. I heard the premier saying that in terms of job advertisements, job availabilities in Montserrat, there needs to be a way to ensure that those are targeted at Montserratians first, Montserratians at home, Montserratians in the diaspora. But then you would need to have that online mechanism in place and working and accessible that Montserratians could access the available jobs and be the first in line to be considered.
Mhm. Well, part of that too, Mike, is not just going to be the fact that you want to give them first option. It's the fact that the salaries need to be competitive. You're asking people to come home for jobs that they can't live a sustainable life, a comfortable life in Montserrat with. And so for them to, you asking them to come home, pick up their lives from wherever they are, and come home to do jobs that they're going to be making maybe a fraction of what they would make somewhere else. I think we also have to consider different modalities of how people might actually need to be working for us that that are beyond what we probably willing to do right now, because it's just not easy every time for someone to pick up and come home to work for something that's less than where they are. So I think that's also part of the attraction that we need to do, is that the jobs need to be more attractive as well in salaries. And it doesn't mean that because the only jobs that you really can get those high competitive salaries would be the ones that are under the technical assistance program, and not every job qualifies for that, because then they get very specific about who they want to give those roles to. So we just need to relook at the salary scales about, what is the quality of life we want people to have when they come home. And right now, what they offer is not it. It's not attractive. So for me, it's not just about, oh, first dibs on a job. Is, do you actually want to come home to work for this? Could you actually have a good quality of life when your salary isn't can't meet the bills and everything in terms of the way the cost of living is in Montserrat right now?
And that's just one example of how the
Mhm.
internet, social media can be utilized
Mhm.
to achieve that structure in some way. Um, Another area that I wish to address with you regarding that is the underpinning infrastructure. Seeing that we're saying that obviously the internet and social media is so important to Montserrat, how stable, how secure is the underlying infrastructure that supports that network? Because at one point there was a lot of talk about remote working, inviting people from overseas to be based in Montserrat and report back to the office, sort of a working from home from a distance.
Mhm.
I do a lot of working from home in London, but the internet is fairly reliable at the upper end of the 90% scale, I should say. What about that's comparison in a Montserrat situation, and not just because Montserrat is smaller. They're small places with fantastically stable, reliable internet services.
I would tell you that I didn't, my issue in Montserrat was not the quality of the internet. It was strong, it was steady. The issue came down to literally utility in terms of sometimes just not having electricity. But as it relate to, I mean, I've had guests come to Montserrat and talk about the fact that the internet there is stronger than where they are in America, and the quality of it. So if for me, it wasn't the quality of the internet, it's literally that our energy just isn't stable, and that makes it not a viable place for you to want to work even remotely, and I worked from home, so it means having to have someplace else where you either have to have a generator or have a friend somewhere where you can go and do some work, if they have power, or you're just out of luck for however long it is. And it was there were days when it was pretty stressful when you literally didn't have power for hours. So that becomes another critical issue of how people can function there. It's not the quality of our internet, it's the support system. The energy just wasn't stable, and that's going to be important going forward, no matter what we want to do there.
Well, I agree with you completely with that because I was speaking recently with an individual, let's say, who is an expert in IT matters, and they were asking about my upload and download rate. And when I told them, and compared to Montserrat, I mean, it was the difference wasn't really huge. But as you said, it's what underpins that the supply of electricity, which must be one of the priority matters for any government to address. But particularly, this government will have to get that sorted out as a top priority, along with the access, along with the health services, along with education, along with everything else that was debated on the platform and detailed in the various manifestos.
Yeah, the thing is, that one is kind of frustrating because I don't even think people understand the magnitude of the situation that Montserrat is in. You have to think that the country has literally just been patching for 25, 30 years. They've just been patching and having to justify to the UK government why they need this and why they need that. And basic things. And it was to the point of embarrassment in the last situation in 2020, 2023 and 2022, where we had those summers of
Yeah.
just exhaustive power outages that really forced the UK government to say, okay, we'll help, we'll try to see what we can do. But we shouldn't have to wait till things are crisis for that to happen. So it it's the generators, it's the whole distribution system that needs changing. You're talking a massive, it's not time for a patch job. It's They need to now be able to tell the UK government, you need to significantly come in and just help us completely rebuild the infrastructure, because what's there is untenable. You can't function like that as a civilized nation, as any nation trying to grow and develop. It just isn't good. And so that's what needs to happen, and that needs to happen just in about every sector. It's time for the patch jobs to be done, and for us to kind of do some really tough have some tough conversations, and also be willing to say, okay, we can't accept this as just enough, because that's what we've also been doing. We're saying, okay, well, you're not going to give us this, we'll do with that. It isn't enough. They really have to be willing to say, okay, we're going to hold out until you can give us what you want, because what you're asking us to accept, we're going to be back here in another 5 years, asking you to upgrade this or do something else. It's time for that.
And when you look at it that way, the perception is a society that's functioning at two extremes. Here we are talking about the impact of social media in the campaign, the utilization of social media, the quality of the internet connection, but yet what is required to support that, to keep it going, is functioning on the basis of something like back in the 1960s. So it's like a society being or trying to operate at two contradictory extremes.
That is actually one of the situations that I think Montserrat has always existed in terms of since I've been there, you know. It's almost this schizophrenia. We're very good at suffering. Our tolerance for pain and discomfort is high. And so we
You
would be
think we're at
happy
the
to.
breaking point when it comes to that now, though?
Yeah, and it's dangerous because when those things happen, it usually manifests in ways that we're not going to be comfortable with, God forbid. But that's what usually happens when people reach that breaking point. And so you can't, it's not even a chance to say, oh, please hold on and wait. It's everybody needs to be able to say, okay, this is what's happening and here's how we're going to resolve it. And hopefully we're going to get some clear responses soon on how they plan to move forward because it's a long time people have been waiting for things to change and living with a whole lot of discomfort that really nobody should have to live with, you know, in their lives and living in a civilized country and a country that is overseas territory of a nation like Britain.
It's a matter, from my perspective, of unrealized potential. The potential is there. It's just that it seems as though either someone is or circumstances are just constantly shifting them slightly, ever so slightly, out of reach all the time.
Hmm.
We could continue with this conversation. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, Nerissa. We always have some very good, enlightening conversations. This certainly won't be the last. Thank you very much for taking the time. You take care of yourself. Thanks for being on board with me.
Take care, Mike. Always the best.